What transforms a valiant soldier into a saint whose influence endures for centuries? Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Society of Jesus, exemplifies the radical transformation that divine grace can work in a soul. From worldly battles to spiritual ones, his life is a testament to a profound conversion, a conversion that changed not only his destiny, but the destiny of the universal church. Through his spirituality, centered on discernment and contemplation, Ignatius bequeathed us a path to encountering God in all things. His story invites us to reflect on our own vocation and the call to holiness that we all receive in baptism. Chapter 1. The Young Knight of Loyola. In the year of our Lord 1491, in the heart of the noble Loyola family, in the Basque country, Íñigo López de Loyola was born, the youngest of 13 siblings. The noble manor house of Loyola, nestled amongst verdant Basque mountains, witnessed the early years of the man destined to be one of the church's greatest saints. From a young age, Íñigo was educated in the virtues of knighthood and the principles of the Christian faith, though his youthful heart leaned more toward worldly glories than celestial ones. Íñigo's youth was spent in the service of Arthur Wellesley, a high-ranking official in the Castilian court, where he learned courtly arts and military skills. He was handsome and gallant, skilled with weapons, and fond of chivalric romances. His ambition was to gain fame and honor on the battlefield, to win the hearts of noble ladies, and to receive the recognition of great lords. As he himself would confess years later, "I was a man given to the vanities of the world, and I especially delighted in the exercise of arms with a great and vain desire to win honor." Divine providence, however, had very different plans for this young knight. In May 1521, during the defense of the fortress of Pamplona against French troops, a cannonball severely wounded both of Íñigo's legs. The French soldiers, admiring his bravery, transported him with honors to his family home in Loyola. There, after 2 painful surgeries that he endured with extraordinary courage, his long convalescence began. He asked for books of chivalry to distract himself, but they only found 2 volumes in the house: Ludolf of Saxony's Life of Christ and The Golden Legend, a collection of saints' lives. Lacking other reading material, Íñigo immersed himself in these books, recounting the exploits of the saints and the life of the Savior. Amidst pain and fever, he began to reflect deeply. What if I did what St. Francis or St. Dominic did? He noticed that while worldly thoughts left him dry and dissatisfied, meditations on imitating the saints filled him with lasting peace and joy. This was the first glimpse of the method of spiritual discernment that he would later develop. And so, in that bed of pain, the proud knight began to die, to give way to the soldier of Christ who was about to be born. During the long, sleepless nights, gazing at the starry sky from his window, Íñigo experienced a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary with the child Jesus, a vision that definitively sealed his conversion. He then decided to abandon earthly weapons and wield spiritual ones, to renounce serving temporal lords, to dedicate himself completely to the service of the eternal King. Upon recovering enough to walk, he set out on a pilgrimage to Montserrat and Jerusalem, shedding his knightly attire and renouncing his inheritance. His family tried to dissuade him, sensing that young Íñigo would never be the same. And they were right. He was no longer Íñigo the knight, but Ignatius, the pilgrim of God, who left the manor of Loyola to embark on a journey that would change the history of the Church. Chapter 2. The Vigil at Montserrat. After a day's journey, limping on his poorly healed leg, Ignatius arrived at the foot of the majestic mountain of Montserrat in March 1522. The jagged silhouette of the holy mountain stood out against the sky like a natural crown for the Queen of Heaven. The pilgrim slowly ascended the cobbled path, meditating at each step on the new life he was about to embrace. The Gregorian chants of the Benedictine monks descended the slopes as if they were the very voice of the sacred mountain, inviting him to delve into its mysteries. Upon arriving at the sanctuary, Ignatius sought a confessor. Providence led him to Father John Benedict, a Benedictine monk of great spiritual wisdom. For 3 days, the future saint made a general confession of his entire life, unraveling with tears and contrition the tangle of his past sins. He left no corner of his soul unexamined, for he wished to present himself before the Virgin completely purified. The good monk, recognizing in that limping pilgrim the flame of an extraordinary vocation, guided him wisely and encouraged him in his purpose of giving himself to God. On the eve of the Annunciation, following the tradition of ancient knights who guarded their arms before being knighted, Ignatius decided to hold his own vigil before the image of the Black Madonna. But this would not be a conventional nightly vigil, but a symbol of his total conversion. Removing his luxurious garments, he exchanged them for a penitent's sackcloth and surrendered his sword and dagger to hang them next to the altar of the Virgin. He donated his horse to the monastery and gave his fine knightly attire to a poor man. In that gesture, Ignatius not only renounced his material possessions, but his entire past identity. Throughout the night, alternating between kneeling and standing, leaning on his cane, the new soldier of Christ remained in prayer before the Black Madonna. The hours passed as the candles consumed their wax, just as he desired to consume his life in the service of God and his mother, in the silence of the night, only interrupted by the gentle murmur of his prayers and the occasional chant of the divine office. Ignatius experienced a deep peace and certainty in his vocation. Before that dark image of the Mother of God holding the child Jesus in her lap, the pilgrim deposited all his dreams of worldly glory and received in return the promise of eternal glory. At dawn on the day of the Annunciation, after participating in Holy Mass and receiving Holy Communion, Ignatius descended from Montserrat transformed. He no longer wore a sword at his side, but the pilgrim's staff. He no longer wore silk and velvet, but the rough sackcloth of the penitent. He no longer wore fine leather boots, but humble sandals. Even his appearance had changed. He had let his hair and nails grow long as a sign of penance. Heading towards Barcelona, Ignatius planned to embark for the Holy Land. However, Providence had a crucial, unexpected stop planned for him. A plague outbreak in Barcelona forced him to stay in a small town called Manresa. He intended to stay just a few days. Those days would become 10 months. 10 months that would change not only his life, but the spirituality of the universal church. Chapter 3. Manresa and the Spiritual Exercises. The small town of Manresa welcomed the pilgrim Ignatius. He sought refuge in the hospital of Santa Lucia to care for the sick and live in extreme poverty. Each day he begged for his sustenance in the streets. He dedicated 7 hours to prayer. He disciplined himself rigorously and visited the cave on the banks of the Cardona River, where he found the silence conducive to his meditations. The townspeople soon began to notice this strange penitent. His appearance was unkempt, but his manner was noble. Some thought him mad, others a saint. Children mocked him, while some pious souls sensed the grace hidden beneath that austere appearance. These months in Manresa were not a bed of roses for Ignatius. After the initial euphoria of his conversion, he fell into a deep spiritual crisis. Scruples tormented his conscience. Even after exhaustive confession, he felt stained by the sins of his past. He fasted to exhaustion, going without food for a whole week. The temptation of suicide assaulted him. Looking at a hole in the floor of his cell, he considered throwing himself in to end his torment. But God's grace did not abandon him. "Don't do such a thing. You would offend your Lord," he said to himself, recognizing the insidious suggestion of the evil one. It was precisely during this dark night of the soul that God prepared in Ignatius the birth of an unprecedented spiritual work. One August day in 1522, sitting on the banks of the Cardona, he experienced a spiritual illumination. He described it as a moment when the eyes of his understanding began to open. He didn't see visions, but he understood the truths of the faith in a new way, as if a veil had been lifted from his mind. He began to take notes on his spiritual experiences, on the movements of consolation and desolation, on the different ways to pray and examine his conscience. These notes would be the seed of what would later be known as the spiritual exercises. His stay in Manresa lasted 10 months, a time Ignatius would later consider his true spiritual university. Here, the Lord taught him as a schoolmaster teaches a child. The lessons were not theoretical, but experiential. He learned to discern spirits, to recognize the interior movements that come from God and those that come from the enemy. He understood that holiness does not consist in external acts of penance, but in the conformity of the human will with the divine. Above all, he discovered the method to help others find this same inner freedom and union with God. When Ignatius finally left Manresa to continue his pilgrimage to Jerusalem, he carried with him much more than his meager belongings. He carried within him, and in his early writings, the treasure of the spiritual exercises, which would become one of the most influential texts in Christian spirituality. This small book, born from personal experience and not from theological speculation, would offer countless souls a practical path to find God in all things and all things in God. The cave of Manresa, that humble space, carved into the rock, had been the cradle of a spiritual revolution that would transcend centuries and borders. Chapter 4. Pilgrim in the Holy Land. After his transformative stay in Manresa, Ignatius resumed his journey to Jerusalem, burning with the desire to set foot on the land sanctified by the steps of the Redeemer. On February 20th, 1523, he embarked from Barcelona for Italy, carrying as his only luggage his trust in divine providence, a copy of the Imitation of Christ, and his notes on the spiritual exercises. The sea voyage was fraught with dangers, storms that threatened to sink the ship, the possibility of encounters with Barbary pirates, and the plague that ravaged various Mediterranean ports. Ignatius, however, sailed with the serenity of someone who has placed his life entirely in God's hands. Upon arriving in Rome, he received the blessing of Pope Adrian VI for his pilgrimage to the holy places. Despite warnings about the dangers involved due to the recent fall of the island of Rhodes to the Turks, nothing could dissuade the pilgrim from his purpose. He continued to Venice, where he embarked again, this time on a ship full of pilgrims who, like him, longed to venerate the tomb of Christ. During the voyage, Ignatius surprised his fellow travelers with his fervent spiritual conversations and his ability to calm spirits when fear or discord arose among them. On September 4th, 1523, Ignatius's eyes finally beheld the holy city. His heart leaped for joy at the sight of the walls of Jerusalem, that city so beloved by Jesus and so present in the Holy Scriptures. During his stay of barely 3 weeks, he visited with immense devotion all the places linked to the life, passion, and resurrection of the Savior: the Holy Sepulchre, Calvary, the Cenacle, the Mount of Olives, Bethany, Bethlehem. In each place, Ignatius not only remembered the gospel events, but contemplated them as if they were happening before his eyes, applying the method of prayer that he would later record in his exercises. His initial intention was to remain permanently in the Holy Land, dedicating his life to the conversion of the infidels. With this purpose, he presented himself to the provincial of the Franciscans, custodians of the holy places, to request permission. However, the political situation was extremely delicate, and the religious, using the authority conferred on him by a papal bull, ordered him to return to Europe with the rest of the pilgrims. Although this decision was a hard blow for Ignatius, he obeyed without complaint, recognizing in that order the will of God. However, before leaving, he wanted to visit once more the Mount of Olives to observe the footprint that, according to tradition, Jesus left when he ascended to heaven. There, he gave the Turkish guard the scissors he carried as his only personal object, bribing him to let him enter. The return to Europe was no less hazardous than the outward journey. Ignatius returned from the Holy Land, his heart brimming with memories, but also with a question that would accompany him for the rest of his journey. What should I do with my life now? The answer began to take shape when, back in Barcelona, he decided that to better serve souls, he needed to study. At 33, the same age as Christ at his death, Ignatius sat among children to learn the rudiments of Latin, beginning a new chapter in his spiritual journey. The pilgrim from Jerusalem became a student, but his goal remained the same: the greater glory of God and the salvation of souls. Chapter 5. The Late Bloomer. Student. After beginning his studies in Barcelona and continuing them briefly in Alcalá and Salamanca, where he was imprisoned and investigated by the Inquisition for his apostolic activities, Ignatius made a momentous decision to move to the University of Paris, the most prestigious intellectual center in Europe. In February 1528, almost 37 years old and using a cane to support his lame leg, the pilgrim crossed the Pyrenees in the dead of winter, braving snow and freezing winds. This journey symbolized his unwavering determination to combat the heresies that were tearing the church apart and to guide souls to God. He needed to arm himself with the weapons of theological knowledge. The early days in Paris were extremely hard for Ignatius. Unfamiliar with French and with meager resources, he had to stay at the hospital of Santiago with poor students and beg for his survival. Academically, his previous education was so deficient that he had to start from the very basics, sitting in the Collège de Montaigu with children to study Latin grammar. His classmates mocked this mature, lame Spaniard conjugating verbs alongside infants, but Ignatius endured the humiliations, his gaze fixed on his goal. During the holidays, he traveled to Flanders to beg among Spanish merchants, gathering enough to support himself for the rest of the year. Despite the difficulties, Ignatius's Parisian stay was extraordinarily fruitful. Gradually, he mastered Latin, philosophy, and finally theology. His professors, though initially skeptical, were impressed by the sharpness of his intelligence and the depth of his insights. Beyond academic knowledge, Ignatius refined his method of spiritual exercises, applying them to fellow students who came to him seeking guidance. His room at the Collège de Sainte-Barbe became an impromptu spiritual consultation room where many found enlightenment for their existential anxieties. It was precisely at Sainte-Barbe that Providence brought Ignatius together with those who would become his first companions. Peter Faber, a humble Savoyard shepherd of brilliant intellect; Francis Xavier, a fiery and ambitious Navarrese nobleman; Diego Lainez and Alphonsus Salmeron, two sharp-minded young Spanish theologians; Nicolas Bobadilla, restless and eloquent; Simon Rodriguez, a melancholic Portuguese. Each with their particular temperament and talents, but all united by their friendship with Ignatius, and above all, by their desire to dedicate themselves completely to the service of God. With them, Ignatius shared not only classrooms and theological debates, but also long spiritual conversations and the exercises which shaped their souls. For 7 years, from 1528 to 1535, Ignatius remained in Paris, transforming from a novice student into a master of arts. These years of intellectual formation complemented his previous spiritual education in Manresa, equipping him for the mission God had in store for him. When he left the city on the Seine, he was no longer a solitary pilgrim, but the leader of a group of friends in the Lord who would soon give rise to a new religious order. Paris had been for Ignatius much more than a university. It had been the crucible where the Society of Jesus was forged, that small army that, under the banner of Christ, would undertake the spiritual reconquest of a world in crisis. Chapter 6. The First Companions. In the austere rooms of the Collège de Sainte-Barbe, among theology books and scholastic debates, a brotherhood began to take shape that would transcend university walls to spread throughout the world. Ignatius, with his penetrating gaze and fervent words, attracted one by one those who would be his first companions. He did not choose them for their intellectual brilliance, although many possessed it, nor for their noble origins, which some enjoyed, but for the sincerity of their spiritual quest and their willingness to dedicate themselves completely to the cause of Christ. Like an expert goldsmith, Ignatius knew how to recognize the precious metal hidden in each of them and patiently work it until it became a jewel. The first to join Ignatius was Peter Faber, a shepherd from the Savoy Alps endowed with extraordinary spiritual sensitivity. They shared a room in the college, and Faber helped Ignatius with his studies while Ignatius guided him on the paths of the Spirit. Francis Xavier, of noble Navarrese family and ambitious character, was perhaps the most hesitant initially. He dreamed of academic triumphs and prestigious ecclesiastical positions, but Ignatius's insistent question, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul?" finally broke down his resistance. Diego Lainez and Alfonsus Salmeron, young Spanish theologians of sharp intelligence, Nicolas Bobadilla, impetuous and eloquent, Simon Rodriguez, a melancholic Portuguese with a poet's soul. Each responded to the divine call that came to them through that unusual middle-aged Spaniard. Ignatius did not limit himself to sharing theological knowledge or devout practices with them. He offered them the transformative experience of the spiritual exercises, guiding each one according to their temperament and needs. In the silence of guided prayer, these young university students discovered the living presence of God, who personally called them to follow him. Meditations on the kingdom of Christ, the two banners, the three binaries of men, helped them clarify their vocation and make radical decisions. Ignatius taught them to find God in all things, in academic studies and disputes, in conversations with companions, in walks along the banks of the Seine, even in adversities and illnesses. The friendship that united this group was not merely human, although it was not lacking in sincere affection, jokes, and confidences. It was above all a friendship in the Lord, cemented in their shared love for Christ and their desire to serve him unconditionally. When they weren't in class, they spent hours conversing on spiritual topics, sharing their prayer experiences, and discerning together what God was asking of them. Sometimes they withdrew to a house on the outskirts of Paris for days of recollection and prayer, or they visited hospitals and prisons together to serve the most needy. Gradually, without them realizing it clearly at first, they were forming a community of life and mission. What made this group of friends unique was the combination of a deep spiritual life with a solid intellectual formation, of the highest contemplation with the most committed action. They didn't aspire to withdraw from the world to seek God in solitude, but to find him and serve him in the midst of the city's bustle, in university classrooms, in hospitals, in courts. Wherever the need was greatest and the work most difficult, Ignatius instilled in them the ideal of being contemplatives in action, men whose gaze, pierced by divine light, would discover God's footprints in everyday reality. Without knowing it then, they were outlining the spirituality that would characterize the future society of Jesus, and that would renew religious life in the universal church. Chapter 7. The Vow of Montmartre. August 15th, 1534, the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, dawned with a clear sky over Paris. Very early, Ignatius and his 6 companions, Peter Faber, Francis Xavier, Diego Lainez, Alfonso Salmeron, Nicolas Bobadilla, and Simon Rodriguez, climbed Montmartre, whose name evokes the blood of the martyr Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris, in the small crypt of the Saint-Denis chapel, far from the city's bustle. They gathered for an act that, unbeknownst to them, would change the history of the church and the world. Peter Faber, the only priest among them, celebrated Holy Mass while the others prepared to pronounce vows that would seal their common destiny. One by one, after receiving Holy Communion, the 7 friends pronounced vows of poverty and chastity, also committing to pilgrimage to Jerusalem to work for the conversion of the infidels. If this journey proved impossible after waiting a year in Venice, they promised to go to Rome to place themselves at the disposal of the Supreme Pontiff, who would decide where they could be most useful for the salvation of souls. This last point, obedience to the Pope, would later be the distinctive characteristic of the Society of Jesus. The vows did not yet constitute the formal foundation of a new religious order, but rather a personal and collective commitment to place their lives entirely at the service of God under the guidance of the Church. The atmosphere of that morning was imbued with a restrained emotion, the solemn joy of those who know themselves to be instruments of a divine design. Ignatius, who had lived so many adventures, the battlefield, convalescence, pilgrimage, persecutions, studies, contemplated with serene satisfaction that handful of men whom God had placed under his guidance. Each of them had his own qualities. Faber, with his gentleness and spiritual depth; Xavier, with his overflowing energy and passionate character; Lainez and Salmeron, with their theological acuity; Bobadilla, with his fiery eloquence; Rodriguez, with his sensitivity and delicacy. Together they formed a mosaic of complementary talents, united by the same love for Christ and his Church. After the ceremony, they shared a simple breakfast on the slopes of the hill, conversing animatedly about their projects and hopes. The plan was to conclude their studies in Paris, meet in Venice at the beginning of 1537, and from there sail to the Holy Land. They were unaware then that Europe was on the verge of a new war between France and the Holy Roman Empire, which would make the journey to Jerusalem impossible. Providence had other designs for that small group. Instead of converting Muslims in Palestine, they would end up working in the heart of Christendom, combating the heresies that threatened to tear apart the seamless tunic of the Church and carrying the gospel to the farthest reaches of the newly discovered world. They descended from Montmartre, transformed, although outwardly nothing had changed. They remained students. They continued to wear their secular clothes. They continued to stay in their respective colleges. But inwardly, something new had been born. What had begun as a spiritual friendship among a few university students was now consolidating as an apostolic brotherhood with a clear purpose and an incipient structure. The seed of the Society of Jesus, that smallest company, as Ignatius would later call it with his characteristic humility, had just been planted in the soil of Montmartre. Watered with the Marian devotion of that day of the Assumption, it would soon grow into a leafy tree whose branches would extend throughout the world, offering fruits of holiness, wisdom, and service to the universal Church. Chapter 8. At the service of the Pope. After completing their studies in Paris and meeting in Venice in January 1537, Ignatius and his companions, to whom 3 new recruits had been added, prepared to embark for the Holy Land. However, the war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire closed the sea routes to the east, forcing them to reconsider their plans. Faithful to the vow of Montmartre, they decided to go to Rome to place themselves at the disposal of the Pope. Before leaving, they received priestly ordination in Venice, except for Ignatius, who preferred to wait to celebrate his first Mass in Jerusalem. Providence, however, had reserved another altar for that solemn moment, the Basilica of St. Mary Major in Rome, where he finally celebrated the Eucharist at Christmas 1538. The journey to Rome was a true trial by fire for the future Jesuits. They traveled on foot, in small groups, begging for their sustenance and preaching in the towns and cities they encountered along the way. In the midst of the Italian Renaissance crisis, with the Protestant threat looming over Europe, these priests, of humble appearance but ardent words, impressed with the solidity of their doctrine and the zeal of their preaching. There were suspicions and accusations, especially against Ignatius, whose austere appearance and message of inner reform evoked the Spanish Illuminati. But this time, the ecclesiastical authorities, after examining their orthodoxy, gave them their approval. The audience with Pope Paul III marked a turning point in the history of that group of friends. The Pope, impressed by their intellectual formation and apostolic fervor, welcomed them with great benevolence and arranged for Lainez and Fabro to teach at the Sapienza University, while Ignatius continued to give the spiritual exercises to influential people in Rome. The seed planted in Montmartre was beginning to bear its first fruits. However, what definitively shaped the course of the nascent company was the mission entrusted to Francis Xavier to depart for the East Indies to evangelize those lands newly discovered by Europe. On the very day that Xavier set off for Lisbon, where he would embark for the East, Ignatius received the oral approval of the formula of the Institute from the Pope. On September 27, 1540, through the bull Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, Paul III officially approved the Society of Jesus as a new religious order. What distinguished this institute from existing ones was precisely its fourth vow. In addition to the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Jesuits pledged special submission to the Roman Pontiff concerning missions. This total availability to be sent anywhere in the world where the Pope considered them most needed became the hallmark of the society. The expression perinde ac cadaver, like a corpse, used by Ignatius to describe perfect obedience, illustrated this unconditional commitment to the service of the Church under the guidance of the Vicar of Christ. The following years saw an extraordinary expansion of the society. While Ignatius remained in Rome as general of the order, drafting the constitutions and directing the enterprise from his humble office, his companions scattered throughout Europe and beyond. Xavier preached in India, Japan, and at the gates of China. Lainez and Salmeron shone as theologians at the Council of Trent. Fabro traveled throughout Germany and Italy. Bobadilla and Rodriguez founded colleges in various cities. Letters circulated constantly among them, maintaining unity in dispersion. Ignatius, like a general directing his troops from the rear guard, assigned missions, resolved conflicts, encouraged the discouraged, and moderated the impulsive. His personal motto, "For the greater glory of God," became the guiding star for all the society's activities, from the education of youth to preaching in mission lands, from advising kings and popes to caring for the sick and poor in hospitals. Chapter 9. The Birth of the Society of Jesus. In the spring of 1539, Ignatius and his companions, already settled in Rome but still unsure of their collective destiny, decided to begin a process of discernment to determine whether they should formally constitute themselves as a new religious order. For several weeks, they alternated intense days of personal prayer with meetings to share their inner movements. The deliberations were not easy. Some, like Nicholas Bobadilla, resisted submitting to a fixed rule that might limit their apostolic freedom. Others doubted practical aspects such as the choice of a superior or the way of making decisions. Ignatius, with his usual prudence, let everyone speak and carefully recorded the conclusions of each day. Finally, on April 15th, they reached unanimity. They would constitute themselves as a religious order under the authority of a superior whom they would obey as if he were Christ. In addition, they would add to the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a fourth vow of special submission to the Pope concerning missions. Ignatius then drafted the formula of the Institute, a brief document that summarized the charism and mission of the new order: to serve God and the Church under the authority of the Roman Pontiff through preaching, spiritual exercises, teaching the catechism, works of charity, and especially the education of youth. The formula was presented to Pope Paul III, who verbally approved it, although he asked that Cardinal Guidiccioni examine it before official confirmation. Cardinal Guidiccioni, known for his opposition to the creation of new religious orders, represented a serious obstacle to Ignatius's plans. The best way to reform religious orders is to suppress them all and reduce them to the original four, he had stated. However, after studying the formula and observing the apostolic work of those priests, he radically changed his mind. On September 27, 1540, Paul III signed the bull Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, by which he officially approved the Society of Jesus, initially limiting the number of its members to 60. This restriction would be lifted 3 years later, given the rapid growth of the order and the multiplication of its works. The name chosen for the new foundation was not accidental. Society of Jesus evoked a military enterprise so familiar to the former soldier that Ignatius was placed at the service of Christ the King. As soldiers of a company, the Jesuits were to stand out for their mobility, discipline, and availability to go where they were most needed. Ignatius himself, in his autobiographical notes, recounts how a vision of Christ carrying the cross, accompanied by the Eternal Father, marked his vocation and that of his companions. "I want you to serve us," the Lord had said to him on the road to La Storta at the gates of Rome. This service to Christ and his Church would be condensed in the motto of the Society, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God, an expression that summarized the ultimate aim of all its undertakings. The first Jesuits gathered to elect their superior general. Although the choice seemed obvious, Ignatius resisted, claiming his unworthiness and his many past sins. He convinced his companions to vote in writing after 3 days of prayer without communicating with each other. The result was unanimous. Everyone except Ignatius himself had elected him as the first superior general of the society. Even so, Ignatius insisted on repeating the vote with the same result. Finally, advised by his confessor, he accepted the position, recognizing in that election the will of God. On April 22, 1541, in the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, the first Jesuits pronounced their solemn vows. The Society of Jesus was officially born, small as a mustard seed, but destined to become a leafy tree that would spread its branches throughout the known world and beyond. Chapter 10. The Missionary Legacy. While Ignatius remained in Rome as general of the society, guiding the nascent order from his austere office, his companions scattered across Europe and the newly discovered territories, sowing the seeds of the gospel. The most emblematic case was that of Francis Xavier, who, after being unexpectedly assigned to the East Indies, unleashed an unprecedented missionary activity. In just 10 years, he evangelized India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, and died at the gates of China, leaving behind thousands of converts and flourishing Christian communities. His letters, filled with apostolic zeal, were read in Jesuit colleges across Europe and awakened numerous missionary vocations among young men. "Tell them to come," he wrote from the remote eastern lands, "for there is work here for many laborers in the Lord's vineyard." The Jesuit missionary method, inspired by Ignatius, was distinguished by its respect for local cultures and its adaptation to the customs of each people, provided they did not contradict the Christian faith. Matteo Ricci in China, Robert de Nobili in India, and Joseph Anchieta in Brazil, among others, deeply studied the languages, philosophies, and traditions of those civilizations, seeking points of convergence with Christian revelation. Instead of imposing European ways of living the faith, they sought to enculturate the gospel, presenting it in a way that was understandable to each people. This strategy, not without its controversies, allowed Christianity to take deep root in lands where it had previously been rejected as a foreign religion. In Europe, the society expanded with equal rapidity. The Jesuits founded colleges in major cities, aware of the importance of education for the reform of the church and society. The Roman College, founded by Ignatius himself in 1551, became the model for all others, combining academic excellence with spiritual and human formation. The Jesuit pedagogical system, which would later be codified in the Ratio Studiorum, revolutionized European education. Classes divided by levels, personalized attention to each student, academic competitions that stimulated learning, theatrical performances for didactic purposes. All of this made Jesuit colleges highly sought after, even by Protestant families who appreciated their educational quality. Parallel to formal education, the Jesuits developed various forms of popular apostolate. Rural missions carried the word of God to remote villages, where religious ignorance was often extreme. Preachers like Peter Canisius in Germany or Peter Claver in Cartagena de Indias adapted their message to the level of their listeners, using illustrated catechisms, simple songs, and presentations that made the truths of the faith accessible. The spiritual exercises, given in versions adapted to different audiences, became a powerful tool for inner transformation. Marian congregations, associations of committed lay people, extended the spiritual influence of the society beyond its institutions. All this missionary dynamism, both in distant lands and in the heart of Christendom, responded to Ignatius's vision of the society as an apostolic body available to go wherever the need was greatest and most urgent. The military image of the company was combined with the mysticism of service. Soldiers of Christ, yes, but in the service of souls, fighting not with material weapons, but with those of the Spirit. From Rome, Ignatius meticulously followed this global expansion, maintaining a busy correspondence with Jesuits spread across 4 continents. Every new foundation, every significant conversion, every difficulty or persecution was communicated to the Father General, who in turn informed the entire society through circular letters. In this way, a Jesuit working in the Brazilian jungle could feel part of the same enterprise as his brother who taught mathematics in Coimbra, or the one who attended to the plague-stricken in Naples. Universality, a distinctive feature of the Catholic Church, found in the Society of Jesus a particularly intense expression. Chapter 11. The Saint's Last Days. In his final years, Ignatius dedicated himself primarily to writing the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, a flexible document that established general principles instead of rigid rules. His health, already deteriorated since his wounds in Pamplona, gradually worsened due to his austerities, illnesses, and intense work as superior general. Despite his physical weakness, Ignatius maintained a serene spirit and continued to lead the society from his modest room in Rome. His contemporaries describe him as an affable but firm man, meticulous in administration, but with a universal vision, who alternated deep prayer with intense work days. At the end of July 1556, Ignatius fell seriously ill. He died quietly in the early morning of July 31st, accompanied only by a coadjutor brother. The news shocked Rome and the entire society. His body was venerated by multitudes, and his tomb soon became a place of pilgrimage. He was canonized in 1622, along with Francis Xavier, Teresa of Avila, and Philip Neri, the Church thus recognizing his heroic path to sainthood and his legacy of total surrender to the divine will. Chapter 12. A Prayer to Saint Ignatius. O glorious Saint Ignatius, valiant soldier of Christ and faithful servant of his Church, you who abandoned worldly glory for the humble service of the eternal King, hear our prayer and come to our aid. Your life is a testament to the transformative power of divine grace, which changed a vain knight into a saint whose influence endures through the centuries. As you did in Loyola, prostrate on a bed of suffering, you discovered the true meaning of your existence. Help us to find in our own tribulations the path to God. Father and teacher of the spiritual exercises, you who in the solitude of Manresa received from the Lord the light to discern the movements of the soul, guide us in our own discernment. Teach us to distinguish the motions that come from the good spirit from those that originate from the enemy. Give us the wisdom to recognize the divine will in the circumstances of our daily lives, and the strength to embrace it with generosity. May we, like you, seek and find God in all things, to serve Him with greater dedication each day. Tireless pilgrim, who traversed dusty roads in search of the Holy Land, and submitted to the authority of the Church when your plans were thwarted, help us to accept life's setbacks with serenity. May we recognize, as you did, that our apparent failures can be the door that God opens to unexpected horizons. Intercede for us, so that amidst our struggles and disappointments we maintain hope and trust in divine providence, which orders all things for our good. Founder of the Society of Jesus, who formed your first companions in the love of Christ and His Church, awaken in our hearts the same apostolic zeal that animated Francis Xavier, Peter Faber, and so many other Jesuit saints. May zeal for the salvation of souls drive us to work tirelessly for the expansion of God's kingdom. Illuminate those who today follow in your footsteps in the society, so that they may be faithful to your original charism and respond creatively to the challenges of our time. Always to the greater glory of God. Finally, Saint Ignatius, you who, after a life of total dedication to Christ's cause, departed serenely to meet the Lord, assist us in our final hour. May we, like you, look back without regrets and forward without fear, trusting in the infinite mercy of the Father, and from now on, teach us to live each day as if it were our last, with the intensity and passion of one who knows they are working for eternity. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, whom you so loved and served, and who lives and reigns forever and ever. Amen.